Hey friends, tonight we're dimming the lights and stepping back into a time when careers were a little different. Before LinkedIn, job interviews, or even standardized spelling, medieval Europe was full of people working jobs that modern HR departments would classify as, quote, deeply concerning. From professional mourners and plague pit diggers to rat catchers with a flair for performance, the Middle Ages had no shortage of peculiar employment opportunities. And yes, some of them were paid in ale, or cheese, or not at all. So if you've ever complained about your inbox, just wait till we meet the guy whose job was to collect leeches with his bare hands. Before we begin, take a second to like the video and subscribe, only if you genuinely enjoy these sleepy stories. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. It's always lovely to see who's falling asleep to the Middle Ages with me. Now, fluff your pillow, get cozy, and imagine a world where your dream job might have involved wrestling pigs in front of a judge, or yelling the news to a town that didn't really want to hear it. Let's begin. Imagine waking up at dawn, tying a bucket to your belt, and heading into a swamp, not for fishing. Not for a peaceful walk, but to wade barefoot through stagnant water in search of blood-sucking parasites. Welcome to the glamorous world of the leech collector. Back in the Middle Ages, leeches weren't just gross. They were medical celebrities. Doctors believed that health depended on balancing the humors of the body: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If you had too much blood, obvious solution: get rid of some, enter the leech. But someone had to find them, and that someone wasn't a fancy surgeon. It was usually a poor villager with a high tolerance for discomfort, and, ideally, less blood than average. Leech collectors, often women, children, or elderly men, would wade into ponds and marshes, letting leeches attach to their legs. Once the little vampires were full, the collectors would peel them off and drop them into jars, ready to be sold to doctors, apothecaries, or enthusiastic barbers with no sense of hygiene. It was dangerous work. Too many leeches, and you could bleed too much. Swamps were also filled with other delightful things, like rats, snakes, and diseases with names that sound like curses. One wrong step and your humble workday turned into an epic tale of trenchfoot. But it paid, sometimes, in coins, food, or the occasional blessing from a grateful doctor. Or not so grateful if the leeches underperformed. Still, this job lasted for centuries. Leeches were part of medicine until the 19th century, and they're still used today in some surgical procedures. Though, thankfully, modern leech handlers wear gloves. And shoes. So next time you're tempted to complain about spreadsheets or customer service emails, remember the leech collector, standing ankle-deep in muck, wondering how much blood loss is too much blood loss. And that's only job number one. Coming up next, we'll meet a professional who specialized in public shouting, dramatic flair, and occasionally being pelted with vegetables. Yes, it's time to hire a town crier. Before newspapers, radios, or that one uncle who posts conspiracy theories on Facebook, there was the town crier, a man, or occasionally a woman, with a strong voice, a big bell, and zero fear of public speaking. Imagine you're living in a medieval village. You can't read. You don't own a book. You barely have socks. But you still need to know things. What the king has decreed, when the market opens. Who's been excommunicated for stealing cheese? Enter the town crier, medieval Europe's loudest and possibly most annoying civil servant. Town criers were official messengers. Paid, sometimes by local authorities, they would walk through towns and villages announcing news, laws, punishments, and proclamations. They wore distinctive uniforms, often with bright colors and a badge of office, so that even the half-blind could tell, ah yes, this man is here to ruin breakfast with news of higher taxes. Their signature move, ringing a bell and shouting, "Oyez, oyez, oyez!" a phrase that basically meant, listen up, or more accurately, stop pretending you didn't hear me. I've got news, and I'm not leaving until I say it. After the oye came the announcement, which could range from new tolls on bridge crossings to all pigs found within the city after sunset will be seized and possibly excommunicated. It was rarely good news. You never heard a town crier shout, "Free pastries behind the chapel," and yet they were essential. In a society where illiteracy was the norm, the town crier was the news. He had to be loud, clear, and ideally not get punched too often. Because here's the thing, people didn't always like the news. In fact, they often hated it. So the crier, as the bearer of bad tidings, became an easy target for tomatoes, turnips, or strongly worded mumblings. In some towns, criers carried a staff instead of a bell and were accompanied by guards because, yes, announcing new taxes sometimes came with death threats. And no, they didn't get hazard pay. Despite the abuse, criers were protected by law. Harming a town crier was considered the same as attacking the king's authority. So if you threw a shoe at him, congratulations. You just insulted the crown and were eligible for a fine, a flogging, or both. Freedom of speech did not extend to beaning the messenger with your breakfast. Some criers had flair. They'd add dramatic pauses, change their tone for emphasis, or slip in sarcastic commentary. Think of them as early stand-up comics, with a government license and fewer jokes. Others were more somber, especially when announcing executions or bans. But regardless of style, their job was the same: yell until everyone knew what was going on. And let's not forget the logistics. Medieval towns didn't have microphones. A crier had to repeat the same message over and over, block by block, corner by corner. One village, 15 announcements, no megaphone. By evening, his vocal cords probably felt like a cheese grater. Oddly, the position lasted into surprisingly modern times. In Britain, town criers still exist, though now it's more ceremonial than urgent. They show up at festivals, historical reenactments, and occasional weddings, though hopefully not to announce your tax audit. So next time you get a push notification or an annoying ad, take a deep breath and be grateful it didn't come with a guy in tights screaming at your window at 7 a.m. Coming up next, a job that involves grief, wailing, and the occasional payment in wine. Yes, it's time to meet the professional mourner. It's the year 1278. Someone important, or at least moderately well-fed, has just died in your town, and as their family prepares for the funeral, a strange thing happens. A messenger is sent, not to a priest or a coffin maker, but to a woman known only as Agnes the Loud. Why? Because in medieval Europe, sometimes your funeral needed volume. Welcome to the curious and utterly melancholic world of the professional mourner. Yes, this was a real job. Professional mourners were typically women, loud, dramatic, and very, very good at crying on demand. Their job was simple in theory, chaotic in execution. Show up at funerals, weep loudly, praise the deceased, and generally raise the emotional temperature until everyone felt appropriately devastated. They weren't relatives. They weren't friends. They were there for the theatrics. Think of them as the medieval version of a one-person soap opera, hired to set the mood. If the deceased had few mourners, or just a reputation that didn't inspire much actual sadness, families would bring in these vocal freelancers to make sure the public display of grief was suitably impressive. Now, in some cultures, professional mourning has ancient roots. Ancient Egypt, Greece, and Rome all had their versions. But in medieval Europe, the practice took on its own flavor. Part performance art, part religious theater, and part community service. A good mourner could cry on cue, shout poetic phrases about the deceased's virtues. He never stole a chicken unless starving, and occasionally beat her chest or throw herself to the ground. If you've ever stubbed your toe and made a bigger scene than necessary, congratulations. You might have had what it took for the job, but the role wasn't all wailing and fainting. These women were often expected to memorize elaborate funeral chants, wear specific mourning clothes, usually black or gray wool, and follow strict rules about pacing and timing. Cry too early, and it looked forced. Cry too late, and people suspected you were holding back for dramatic effect. Sometimes, mourners would accompany the body from the home to the church, crying the whole way down the road. Imagine trying to carry a coffin while a hired chorus wails beside you like a sad mariachi band. It added weight, emotional weight, and some very questionable harmonies. Pay varied, of course. Some were given a few coins. Others got food, leftover wine, or, in especially generous cases, a place to sleep for the night. Hopefully not next to the corpse. There are records of professional mourners being listed in estate ledgers. 3 pence to Joan the Screamer, or 2 loaves and a flagon for Ellsworth, she of many laments. You might wonder, why go through all this? Why pay someone to cry? Because appearances mattered. Funerals were public events, and grief was performative. A loud funeral showed respect, community, and piety. It told neighbors, look how much we cared, even if, in private, you were mostly wondering if you inherited the cow. And here's the strange part. Sometimes these mourners were too good. There are stories of families asking them to tone it down. He was nice, but not that nice. A few gained reputations for being so convincingly devastated that people assumed they were secret lovers of the deceased. One mourner in 14th century France had to publicly swear she'd never met the man before the funeral. She just had a naturally dramatic weep. Over time, the church grew suspicious of these theatrics. Some clergy argued that professional mourning was insincere, even sinful. Crying, they said, should come from the soul, not the payroll. But that didn't stop the practice. It continued, quietly, for centuries. Even into the 19th century, mourners for hire could still be found in parts of rural Europe. Today, the idea might seem strange. We grieve in quieter, more private ways. But there's something oddly touching about a time when grief was considered too important to risk underwhelming. When families thought, let's hire someone who can really bring the emotional fireworks, and if nothing else, it meant someone was always there to say goodbye. Loudly. Dramatically. Possibly while fainting into a borrowed cloak. Next, we'll explore a job that's half sanitation, half horror film, and 100% unpleasant. The medieval gong farmer. Let's set the mood. It's a warm summer night in a 14th century city. The taverns have emptied, the church bells have gone silent, and across the cobblestones drifts a smell so powerful, so indescribable, it could stun a bishop. From the shadows, a man appears, dragging a cart, wearing clothes so stained they might have once been brown, or perhaps red, or perhaps they're just made of smell now. In his hand, a shovel. On his face, quiet resignation. This, dear listener, is a gong farmer, and his job? Human waste. All of it. The name comes from the word gong, which in medieval English meant, well, you can guess. Let's just say it wasn't a musical instrument. Gong farmers were the men tasked with cleaning out latrines, cesspits, and privies. In an era before plumbing, flushing, or basic hygiene, someone had to deal with the consequences of every medieval meal, and that someone was often ankle-deep in it. And here's the wild part. This was a real profession. Official, licensed, and even, brace yourself, moderately well paid. Why? Because no one else wanted to do it. Which, fair. The job usually started after dark. Gong farmers worked at night, not out of romance, but because the smell during daylight would have driven the population into the sea. They'd descend into cesspits, sometimes several meters deep, with nothing but shovels, buckets, and the will to survive. No gloves. no masks, just a strong constitution and the desperate hope that no one above would accidentally drop a torch. Once the material was removed, it was loaded into carts and hauled out of the city to designated dumping grounds, usually outside the walls, near the fields, where it could be used as fertilizer. Yes, medieval farming had a certain cyclical logic. It gets worse. In larger cities like London or Paris, cesspits weren't just dirty, they were structural hazards. They were built under homes, inns, or even churches, and if left too long, they could overflow. There are actual historical accounts of buildings collapsing into their own sewage. It's the kind of event that makes you reconsider your religious views, or at least your architectural ones. Sometimes, gong farmers were called in after such disasters, crawling under ruins to shovel what no man should have to shovel. They didn't wear helmets, or boots, or anything that could be described as protective gear. Just layers of old clothes and, one hopes, a really strong bath afterward, assuming they had access to water that wasn't trying to kill them. They weren't entirely unappreciated. Some towns paid them fairly well, considering. They earned more than many laborers, and in some cases had contracts with the city. There were even rules to protect them. They couldn't be interrupted while working, and attacking a gong farmer was a serious offense. Because when someone's covered in that much evidence, you think twice before picking a fight. And yet, their social standing was rock bottom. People would cross the street to avoid them. They couldn't live in certain neighborhoods. Children probably whispered ghost stories about them. Be good, or the gong farmer will come for you with his bucket. Still, some took pride in the job. After all, without sanitation, cities would have been unlivable. Disease, rats, flooding. It all got worse when the gong farmer disappeared. He may not have worn armor or saved maidens, but he did save lives. Quietly. Smellily. And with a job title that really didn't get enough PR help. You might wonder, did they ever have apprentices? Yes, usually younger men, sometimes boys, who were unlucky, orphaned, or just strong enough to lift a shovel without asking too many questions. It was a career path, a smelly, unsung, and crucial career path. So the next time you flush a toilet without thinking or complain about a clogged drain, take a moment to honor the medieval gong farmer. The man who walked into the darkest, filthiest corners of human civilization and said, "Yep, I've got this." And now that our noses have fully adjusted, let's move on to a more musical but no less dangerous job. The medieval rat catcher. The rat. Nature's tiny opportunist. A creature that, for centuries, has thrived in the places humans least want it. Our food, our walls, our nightmares. But in medieval Europe, rats weren't just annoying, they were harbingers of death. Enter the rat catcher. Equal parts exterminator, street performer, and borderline lunatic. Let's rewind to the days before pest control services, mousetraps, or even the faintest understanding of disease. The 14th century is knocking, and it's brought its favorite plus one, the Black Death, with fleas riding rats like tiny parasitic cowboys, plague spread across Europe faster than gossip in a monastery. People needed a solution, and no one wanted to catch rats personally. And so, a new breed of professional emerged, the medieval rat catcher. Usually a man, often eccentric, and occasionally missing a few fingers, he was the one brave, or desperate, enough to say, "Yes, I will chase rats for a living." But how exactly did one catch a rat in a world without traps? Options varied. Some catchers used trained animals, especially small terriers, which were beloved for their rat hunting enthusiasm. Others relied on bare hands and quick reflexes, which says more about the medieval immune system than it does about safety standards. Then there were the poisons. Medieval recipes for rat poison included delightful ingredients like arsenic, hemlock, or powdered glass. Side effects included killing the rat and occasionally the family's cat, a small child, or anyone who mistook it for seasoning. Safety labeling was not a strength. Some rat catchers set traps, clever wooden boxes or nooses baited with bits of cheese or fat. Others claimed to use charms or spells, and yes, a few were suspected of being part-time sorcerers. One 15th century rat catcher in Bohemia reportedly sang to the rats as he worked, which either enchanted them into cages or drove the neighbors to drink. And of course, there were those who performed. Rat catchers who dressed in strange outfits, played flutes or drums, and turned their work into a street show. Crowds would gather to watch them catch and bag the rats, laughing, clapping, and then running when the bag twitched too much. Some historians believe this is how the legend of the Pied Piper began. A rat catcher so charismatic, he started a myth. But here's the grim part. Most people in medieval towns thought rats were just annoying. They didn't yet understand disease transmission. So rat catchers were hired more often to deal with infestations in food storage or church basements, not as plague prevention. Still, some cities did take them seriously. In parts of Germany and France, rat catchers were licensed by the town. They were paid in coins, meals, or, in lean times, by the tail. That's right, rat tails were currency. You brought a sack of 50, dumped them on the mayor's table, and got your fee, hopefully before someone screamed and threw them into the fire. It wasn't a respected job. Rat catchers often smelled bad, looked worse, and were blamed for everything from the weather to failed crops. And yet, when the rats came back, so did the calls. Because in the end, nobody wanted to face a squeaking army alone. In some towns, they doubled as snake catchers or bat removers, making them the unofficial wildlife control department of the medieval world. If it moved fast, bit hard, and made mothers scream, the rat catcher was sent in. And yes, some got sick. Some got bitten. Some, tragically, became part of the very plague they tried to stop. But others survived for years, earning nicknames like Rat Jack or Old Scratchy, and leaving behind fewer stories than scars. Today, the idea of chasing rats through the streets with a bag and a stick seems absurd. But back then, it was a service, a calling. And in a world where the line between life and death was often the width of a flea, the rat catcher stood, twitching sack in hand, as a strange and unsung hero. Next, we'll turn to a profession that combined religion, record-keeping, and a fair amount of candle wax. Let's meet the sleepy yet powerful world of the monastic scribe. Picture a cold stone room lit only by candles and a small warped window. The air smells of wax, dust, and old parchment. There is no sound except for the gentle scratch-scratch of a quill across vellum. The man hunched over the desk isn't reading. He's writing. Slowly, painfully, for hours. Welcome to the daily grind of the monastic scribe. Before printing presses, bookstores, or enthusiastic teenagers tweeting philosophy quotes they don't quite understand, there were scribes. These were monks who devoted their lives, literally, to copying texts by hand, word by word, page by page, often for years. Scribes lived in monasteries, and their workplace was the scriptorium, a sort of holy office space where the dress code was robes and the printer jam was everything. There were no shortcuts, no spell check. If you misspelled something, you couldn't just erase it. You had to scrape the ink off the parchment with a knife, gently. While praying, no one noticed. The materials were as dramatic as the process. Paper wasn't common yet, so scribes wrote on vellum, specially prepared calfskin. Each sheet had to be cleaned, stretched, scraped, and dried. It was expensive, fussy, and slightly unsettling if you liked cows. Quills were made from bird feathers, often goose or swan, and had to be trimmed constantly. Ink was made from soot, gallnuts, or crushed bugs. A good inkwell was a scribe's best friend, besides the saint they were muttering to under their breath. The work was painstaking. Monks would spend years copying Bibles, sermons, legal texts, or ancient classics. A large manuscript could take a single scribe a decade. Imagine spending 10 years transcribing something only to discover you'd spelled psalm wrong 600 times. But it wasn't all mind-numbing repetition. There was beauty, too. Scribes often included illuminations, decorative initials, borders, and miniature illustrations, sometimes in gold leaf. That's right, gold. Tiny flecks of it were pressed into the page to highlight important letters or images. A well-illuminated manuscript wasn't just a book, it was a work of art. One that sparkled in candlelight and weighed more than a newborn goat. Of course, not every scribe was an artist. Some were glorified copy machines, told to write fast, stay quiet, and stop complaining about the ink stains on their hands. Others had more freedom, and that's where things get fun. Hidden in the margins of medieval manuscripts are some of history's greatest inside jokes. Cats chasing mice, monks fighting snails, naked men playing bagpipes. No one knows why these were drawn, but they're there, etched beside holy texts, as if the scribe just couldn't help himself. Some scribes left sarcastic notes at the end of long works. Things like, "Thank God it is finished," or "This took too long. My hand is cramped. Pray for me." One even wrote, "Whoever reads this, remember the poor scribe who copied it in winter, without fire, with frozen fingers." These weren't just quiet monks. They were the burned-out office workers of the medieval world, powered by prayer, dry bread, and sheer stubbornness. And then there were the rules. Scribes had to work in silence. Many took vows of silence altogether, meaning they spent years writing about talking without ever doing it. Their days were scheduled down to the minute. Morning prayers, writing, meals in silence, writing, evening prayers, more writing, and then bed. It was a lonely job, but an important one. Without scribes, entire libraries of ancient knowledge would have been lost. Every copy of every book before the 15th century came from someone like Brother Ethelric, hunched over a desk, squinting by candlelight, silently asking himself why Philosophia has so many letters. Eventually, scribes were replaced by the printing press. Gutenberg's machine arrived in the mid-1400s, and suddenly, one man could do in days what had taken scribes years. The monks didn't protest. Most were probably relieved. But the legacy remains. Thousands of hand-copied manuscripts still exist, many covered in fingerprints, wine stains, and margin doodles. And behind each one was a tired monk with ink on his face, a crick in his neck, and a deep, deep knowledge of how to spell purgatory. Next up, a job that's part hospitality, part security, and mostly just chaos management. Let's spend a night with the medieval innkeeper. Let's say you're a traveler in 14th century Europe. Maybe you're a merchant hauling wool, a pilgrim chasing relics, or just someone who took a wrong turn and ended up 40 miles from your goat. The sun is setting. The roads are muddy. Wolves are howling in the forest. And there it is, a wooden sign creaking in the wind, swinging above a crooked door, the golden trout, or the wounded stag, or the sort of clean spoon. You've arrived at the medieval answer to a hotel, the inn. And somewhere inside, behind the bar, and probably shouting at someone about a stolen chicken, is the innkeeper. Arguably the busiest, crankiest, and most overworked person in town. Inns in the Middle Ages weren't like the ones we picture today. There was no concierge, no bellhop, no room service, unless you counted someone yelling, "We're out of stew!" from across the room. But they were essential. Travelers needed shelter, food, a place to tie up the mule, and, if they were lucky, a bed that didn't crawl. The innkeeper was the one who made it all happen. Sort of. Most medieval inns were family-run affairs. The inn was often just a slightly larger house with a common room, a few beds or piles of straw, a fire, and a single outhouse located just far enough away to make you consider holding it until sunrise. The innkeeper cooked, cleaned, served drinks, dealt with drunk pilgrims, settled arguments, bartered with passing traders, kept records for the tax collector, and occasionally helped deliver babies. Multitasking was not optional. One of their main jobs was food, and we use that word generously. Stew was the dish of choice, mostly because you could keep it simmering indefinitely, and no one remembered what was in it by day 3. If you asked what kind of meat was in it, the answer was yes. The bread was hard, the beer was warm, and the cheese had a personality. But it was food. It filled your stomach and didn't always kill you. A win, by medieval standards. Then there was drink. Inns were also taverns, meaning the ale flowed freely, and so did the gossip. An innkeeper was a walking news network. They knew which noble was feuding with whom, where the roads were flooded, and who had recently confessed to something very interesting. If you wanted to learn what was happening in the next town over, you didn't ask a priest. You asked the innkeeper after buying a drink. Of course, things got rowdy. Fights broke out, tables flipped. Occasionally someone fell into the fire. And who had to deal with it? The innkeeper. Often with a broom, a frying pan, or a look that could curdle milk. Some inns employed muscle, big guys with names like Hob or One-Eyed Dan. But many relied on the innkeeper's sharp tongue and sharper broom handle. And then came the beds. Or rather, bed. Singular. Most inns didn't offer private rooms. You got a spot on a mattress, which you shared with strangers. There are actual historical records of 4 or 5 people crammed into the same bed. 2 lying head to foot, 1 curled at the footboard, 1 clinging to the edge in despair. If you were lucky, you got a place by the wall. If not, you were stuck next to a man named Walter, who snored like a blacksmith with a sinus issue. Innkeepers kept track of who got which spot, sometimes with chalk marks, sometimes just by shouting. Blankets were thin, lice were thick, and the noise ranged from gentle snoring to full symphonic coughing. But still, it was better than wolves. Some inns doubled as stables, meaning animals slept under the same roof. Imagine drifting off to sleep with the sound of horses, pigs, and a goat chewing on your shoe. For the innkeeper, this meant even more work. Feeding animals, mucking stalls, chasing livestock that wandered into the kitchen again. Prices varied. Some inns charged a few coins. Others accepted goods. Cheese, firewood, gossip. If you had nothing, you might be asked to chop wood, sweep floors, or entertain the guests with a song, dance, or a particularly good story about falling into a river. Of course, the innkeeper also dealt with the authorities. They were expected to report suspicious travelers, collect tolls, or occasionally host royal messengers with egos the size of their feathered hats. And if a crime happened at the inn, guess who had to explain it to the sheriff? Still, for all the work, innkeepers were important figures. They kept people moving. They offered warmth, food, and, if not comfort, at least shelter. And in a world without Yelp reviews, their reputation spread by word of mouth. A good innkeeper had loyal customers. A bad one had an empty common room and a rat problem. Today, we complain about hotel Wi-Fi or how the minibar is overpriced. But in the 14th century, you were just happy if the ale was cold, the stew didn't bite back, and the bed only snored a little. Coming up next, a career that mixed comedy, danger, and politics in equal measure. Yes, it's time to meet the medieval jester. If you imagine a medieval court, you might picture kings and queens in jewel-encrusted robes, nobles whispering behind goblets of wine, and somewhere in the background, a jester. Bells jingling from a motley hat, painted face, maybe juggling apples or balancing on one leg. But don't be fooled by the floppy shoes and silly songs. The court jester was one of the sharpest and strangest figures in medieval society. He was part comedian, part counselor, part social safety valve. And unlike most people at court, he could say almost anything. Emphasis on almost. Jesters, sometimes called fools, were entertainers officially employed by royalty or nobility. Their job, make people laugh, but not just with jokes and acrobatics. A good jester used satire, wit, and careful commentary to poke fun at the powerful, especially their employer. Sounds risky. It was. The jester walked a tightrope between hilarity and heresy. Mock too gently, and you're just background noise. Mock too hard, and you're headless background noise. But when done well, a jester could say things no one else dared. Imagine being able to look the king in the eye and say, "You're acting like a goat on market day," and not only survive, but get applause. The origins of jesters go back to ancient times, but in the Middle Ages, they hit their stride. Many were physically or mentally different, which medieval society often misread as touched by the divine, or at least weird enough to be funny. Others were just brilliant performers, selected for their verbal gymnastics and fearless attitude. A jester's toolkit was vast. Jokes, rhymes, songs, riddles, impressions, slapstick. Some carried props like wooden sticks, shaped like a caricature of themselves, called a bauble. Others played instruments, danced, or performed sleight of hand. And a few simply relied on their razor-sharp tongue and an encyclopedic memory for who did what with whom after the third cup of wine. But here's what made jesters truly special. They weren't just clowns. They were often trusted advisors, albeit ones who wore bells. Kings, it turns out, appreciated someone who told the truth without the varnish. In a room full of sycophants and schemers, the jester could say, "Your Majesty, your plan is dumber than a sack of wet onions," and instead of being exiled, he'd be asked to elaborate. Carefully, one famous jester, Will Somers, served Henry VIII. Yes, that Henry, the one with the wives and the mood swings. Somers survived his entire reign, reportedly by being witty, kind, and knowing exactly when to stop talking. He even got away with mocking Henry's weight, a feat no doctor or advisor dared attempt. Another, Triboulet, served the French king Francis I, and once insulted a noble so thoroughly he was sentenced to death. The king, amused, gave him permission to choose how he'd die. Triboulet replied, "By old age." The king laughed and let him live. Of course, not every jester was so lucky. Some did cross the line. There are records of fools who were dismissed, imprisoned, or simply vanished after a poorly timed jab about the Queen's fashion sense. You had to read the room, and fast. Jesters didn't just entertain royalty, though. Some performed for courts, cities, or even traveled as freelancers. They'd perform in marketplaces, festivals, or be hired for weddings and feasts. A talented jester could make a decent living, by medieval standards, though not always in money. Payment sometimes came in food, clothing, or the rare luxury of not being kicked. And yes, there were female jesters too. They appear in records under names like Mathurin and Jane Fool, often serving queens or noblewomen. Their humor could be just as sharp, and their jobs just as precarious. Ironically, as society modernized, jesters declined. By the 18th century, they were mostly gone, replaced by court theater, writers, and increasingly serious ideas about respectability. But echoes of their legacy remain. The stand-up comedian, the political cartoonist, the satirist, who dares to say the thing everyone's thinking. So while the court jester may look like the fool, he was often the only one allowed to be honest. And in a world where heads rolled for much less, that was a kind of genius. Next, we turn from jesters to something quieter, though no less peculiar. Let's visit the secretive world of the sin eater. Imagine it's a quiet evening in a medieval village. A candle flickers in a window. A bell tolls slowly in the distance. Inside a small cottage, a family gathers around the body of a loved one. The priest has come and gone. Prayers have been said. But one final ritual remains. A wooden plate is placed on the chest of the deceased, a crust of bread, a sip of ale, and then a knock at the door. Enter the sin eater. He, or occasionally she, sits at the foot of the bed. No formal robes, no incense, no church affiliation. Just a deeply quiet presence and a job description that sounds like a riddle. Because this person isn't here to mourn, they're here to eat the sins of the dead. It sounds like folklore, the stuff of ghost stories whispered by candlelight. But sin-eating was a real practice, particularly in parts of Britain and rural Europe, from the late Middle Ages into the early modern period. It wasn't sanctioned by the church. In fact, it was usually frowned upon. But it persisted for centuries, quietly, in corners where superstition and desperation lived side by side. The idea was simple and deeply symbolic. At death, the soul was believed to carry the weight of unconfessed sins. In ideal cases, a priest would hear a final confession and absolve them. But not everyone had that chance. Maybe the priest didn't arrive in time. Maybe the person died suddenly. Maybe they weren't quite religious enough to be on speaking terms with the local abbey. Whatever the reason, families wanted reassurance. And so, the sin eater was called. The ritual varied by region, but usually involved food, placed either on the body or nearby. Bread, ale, sometimes salt. The sin eater would say a short, often mumbled prayer, and then eat the food. In doing so, it was believed they symbolically absorbed the sins of the departed. The soul, now lightened, could pass on in peace. In theory, beautiful, redemptive, oddly poetic. In practice, terrifying. Because if you take on someone's sins, where do they go? Into you. That was the fear. And the reason sin eaters were both needed and avoided. Most communities kept theirs at a distance. They were tolerated, but rarely embraced. People whispered that a sin eater's soul became stained over time, that each ritual made them darker. Some believed sin eaters were cursed, or at best, walking spiritual sponges, full of other people's regrets, lies, and broken promises. They were rarely paid well, a few coins, a crust of bread, a sip of beer. No thanks, no ceremony, just the plate, the prayer, the bite, and the quiet exit. It was a job of solitude, performed in silence, under cover of night, while the village tried not to look too closely. No one kept records. No one wrote manuals. Being a sin eater wasn't a profession you studied for. It was something passed down, whispered from one outsider to another. Maybe you were born into it. Maybe your mother did it, or your grandmother. Maybe the role simply fell to you one day, when someone knocked on your door and said, "There's been a death." Sin eaters show up in the records of Wales, the Scottish Highlands, and the borderlands of England. But similar traditions existed elsewhere, often under different names. In parts of Central Europe, food was left with the dead for days, then fed to animals, or burned or eaten by someone believed to carry protective power. There were even echoes in some early Christian and Jewish customs, though nothing quite so literal. The sin eater, then, was part of a larger tapestry of belief, where death was both a personal sorrow and a communal burden, where someone had to help carry the weight, even if it meant being marked by it. By the 18th century, the practice had faded, mocked by Enlightenment thinkers, condemned by the church, and quietly abandoned by villagers eager to modernize. The last known sin eater in Wales supposedly died in the early 1900s, though some say the practice lingered longer, unspoken, in remote places. Today, the sin eater is mostly remembered in legends, horror films, and metaphor, a symbol of sacrificial grace, or a reminder that, sometimes, the most important jobs are the ones no one wants. So if you've ever carried someone else's guilt, comforted a stranger, or absorbed the sadness of a moment so others didn't have to. Congratulations. You've shared a strange kinship with the sin-eaters of old. And now, let's move to a role that's a little more visible, a little more dramatic, and just as misunderstood. In our final job of the night, we'll meet the herald, the loudest fashion critic and genealogist in medieval Europe. Our final medieval professional isn't covered in muck or sorrow or leeches. No, this one comes dressed in brilliant colors, armed with a trumpet, a scroll, and a terrifyingly detailed memory for who is allowed to wear what shade of blue. Meet the herald, the medieval expert in shouting, symbols, and sorting out noble drama with the precision of a courtroom clerk and the flair of a tournament announcer. At first glance, the herald might seem like the medieval version of a town crier, loud, theatrical, prone to standing on things while reading decrees. But the job went far beyond that. A good herald was part genealogist, part diplomat, part fashion police, and part historical archivist. Let's break it down. Heralds originally appeared on the battlefield, not to fight, but to identify. In an era when everyone wore armor and helmets, it was hard to tell who was who without removing someone's head first. Not ideal. So knights began decorating their shields and tunics with symbols: lions, stripes, eagles, checkers. These were personal coats of arms, and someone needed to keep track of them. Enter the herald. They memorized hundreds of family crests and knew exactly which knight bore which colors. They could tell you, at a glance, that the man charging across the field with a golden stag on a blue background was Sir Reginald of Upper Wembley, third son of Baron Reginald of Lower Wembley, currently feuding with the House of Red Geese. Handy knowledge, especially if you wanted to stay on the right side of a feud. In peacetime, heralds organized tournaments, massive medieval sporting events that combined jousting, feasting, and courtly gossip. Heralds announced the competitors, settled disputes over noble lineage, and ensured no knight was wearing the wrong emblem. Because yes, it mattered. If you claimed the wrong arms, you might as well have called someone else's grandmother a goat. And let's talk about heraldry, the full-time obsession of many a medieval herald. Every coat of arms followed strict rules. Colors, called tinctures, couldn't be combined willy-nilly. You couldn't put color on color, like red on blue, or metal on metal, like gold on silver. The symbols had meanings: lions for courage, boars for fierceness, swans for slightly smug elegance. Even the direction an animal faced mattered. Facing right? Honorable. Facing left? Suspicious. Upside down? Possibly a joke. Heralds kept massive books of arms, updating them with births, marriages, and battles. These books, called armorials, were the social registries of their time. Want to prove your noble blood before a wedding, a trial, or a particularly snobby dinner party? Call the herald. But they weren't just record keepers. Heralds were also messengers, especially for royalty. They carried announcements, negotiated truces, and even delivered ultimatums before wars. In fact, the phrase, "don't shoot the messenger," that started with heralds. They were considered untouchable under the rules of war. If a herald showed up in your camp waving a scroll, you had to hear him out, even if you hated his outfit. Their uniforms were called tabards, loose, sleeveless garments emblazoned with the coat of arms of the noble or monarch they served. You couldn't miss them. They looked like walking flags. But that was the point. A herald wasn't meant to blend in. He was meant to be seen, heard, and ideally remembered. Training to become a herald took years. You started as a pursuivant junior herald, learning symbols, lineage, and how to shout clearly without inhaling parchment. Over time, you might rise to full herald and possibly even to king of arms, the highest-ranking herald in a realm. Not bad for someone whose job involved yelling in public and memorizing who married whose cousin in 1362, and yes, this role still exists. In Britain today, there's still a college of arms, with official heralds who manage ceremonial duties, grant new coats of arms, and probably still grumble when someone tries to use metal on metal. So the next time you see a medieval film with knights in identical armor, remember the poor herald who once had to look across a battlefield, squint at a charging figure and declare, "That's not Sir Geoffrey. That's Sir Ralph. His eagle only has 3 heads." And with that, dear listener, we close our scroll of medieval odd jobs. From leech collectors to jesters, sin eaters to scribes, it turns out the past was full of people doing the kind of work that makes your inbox seem not so bad after all. Time now to rest your eyes. Let the bells fade. Let the parchment settle. The herald has spoken. Sleep well. There are jobs you brag about, and then there are jobs you never mention when someone asks, "So what do you do for a living?" In medieval Europe, few roles were more necessary or more avoided in conversation than that of the executioner. Cue the hood, the axe, and the long, awkward silence. Now, you may be imagining a dramatic figure dressed in black leather, standing ominously by a chopping block while lightning crashes in the background. And yes, that's one version, though mostly invented by Hollywood. The reality was a little less theatrical, a little more bureaucratic, and a lot more lonely. Let's begin with the obvious. Medieval justice was creative. Punishments ranged from fines to floggings to, yes, public executions. When the time came to carry one out, someone had to do the job. Not the judge, not the mayor. Enter the executioner. But contrary to legend, executioners weren't always strangers in hoods. In many towns, they were local officials with a very specific set of responsibilities. Yes, they executed criminals, but that was just the headline task. They also carried out amputations for punishment, oversaw torture when it was legally required, branded thieves, and occasionally cleaned the town's gallows. Their tools? Swords, axes, ropes, and sometimes fire. Their motto? Probably something like, "It's not personal, it's municipal." It wasn't a job people wanted, mind you. Executioners were often assigned their roles because they were the only ones willing, or because they'd inherited it. In some families, the job passed down like a cursed heirloom. "Congratulations, son, you now own this sword, this mask, and everyone's suspicion." Because here's the twist. While the executioner served the law, he was often treated like an outsider. People didn't shake his hand. Merchants might refuse to sell him bread. His children weren't always welcome at school. It was as if handling death professionally made him somehow untouchable. And yet, the executioner held a strange kind of power. He knew everyone's secrets, the criminals, the confessions, the political whispers behind certain sentences. Sometimes, he even spoke for the condemned, relaying last words or declarations of innocence. In that moment, he was both feared and trusted. Some were precise professionals. The best executioners could take off a head in a single stroke. It was considered merciful. A clean cut was an art, and the public noticed. A botched job, too many swings, a missed neck, could spark outrage, or worse, a riot. Others specialized in hanging, or more elaborate punishments. In Germany, there were executioners who were minor celebrities, known for their speed, their technique, or their dramatic speeches. Some even published memoirs. Yes, executioner tell-alls existed, full of gallows humor and philosophical musing. But for all the drama, the executioner was still a civil servant. He was paid by the town, sometimes with coin, sometimes with land. Some were given homes outside city walls, symbolic of their social exclusion. Others lived within the town, but were expected to enter only certain areas. In one Swiss village, the executioner had to ring a bell when entering the market, so no one would accidentally brush against him. That said, people needed him. Crime didn't stop, justice had to be carried out. And when things went really wrong, plague outbreaks, political unrest, It was often the executioner who was called to restore order. One historical record mentions an executioner being asked to remove diseased bodies because no one else would touch them. In some rare cases, executioners were respected for their service. If they were especially skilled or unusually humane, townspeople might quietly offer them food or speak well of them behind closed doors. Still, friendship was rare. It was hard to be seen as just doing your job when your job involved axes and final words. Eventually, as legal systems evolved and capital punishment became less public, the role of the executioner faded. But the legacy lingers in myths, in theater, in nervous jokes about having a bad day at the office. So the next time your work feels underappreciated, remember the medieval executioner, invisible when things go right, blamed when they don't, and still expected to swing on time. Coming next, a job with less blood and more bureaucracy. The medieval scribe spy, or how some writers used ink for intelligence gathering. Most people think of medieval spies as men in cloaks darting through castle corridors, passing secret messages under the table at a banquet, or eavesdropping from behind a tapestry. And yes, that happened. But sometimes the most effective espionage didn't wear a hood. Sometimes it wore reading glasses and carried a quill. Welcome to the peculiar world of the scribe spy. Now, we've already met the monastic scribe, the quiet, ink-stained monk copying holy texts by candlelight. But outside the cloisters, there existed a different breed of scribe. These were men, and occasionally women, hired not just to write, but to watch, listen, and report. Their cover? Clerical work. Their real job? Intelligence. Scribes in royal courts, merchant houses, and even cathedrals often had access to private information. They wrote letters, copied legal documents, recorded meetings, and drafted treaties. They sat in on negotiations, traveled with ambassadors, and sometimes translated foreign correspondence, all of which made them uniquely valuable to everyone. Imagine being a king who just negotiated a secret alliance. Who else knew? The diplomat, of course, and the scribe who wrote it all down in triplicate and remembered every comma. It didn't take long for powerful people to realize, if you want to know what's really going on, ask the scribe, or better yet, hire the scribe. In many cases, scribes became double agents. They'd work for a noble, then quietly sell information to another. Others were recruited outright by rulers looking to outmaneuver their rivals. Still, others were placed strategically by the church, eager to track heresy, political shifts, or any noble planning to, quote, accidentally delay a tithe. One famous example comes from the court of Richard II of England. His scribes were so tightly woven into political matters that some of them were later accused of treason when the winds of favor changed. They hadn't wielded swords or shouted rebellion. They'd simply written things down and kept the wrong secrets. Some scribe spies worked for foreign powers, especially in trade cities like Venice or Constantinople. Multilingual, well-traveled, and fluent in legalese, they were perfectly positioned to gather information and send coded letters back to their employers. And because they were just writers, they were often overlooked at customs, taverns, and diplomatic events. These scribes developed their own methods for concealing messages. Invisible ink made from lemon juice or milk, marginal notes that seemed like decorative flourishes but were actually cipher keys, even folded letters designed so that opening them without tearing was nearly impossible. A medieval tamper seal. There were also entire languages of euphemism. Our Venetian friend with the crooked nose might refer to a rival merchant. The price of salt is unstable could mean war was brewing, and the quills are worn thin might suggest someone was writing more than just ledgers. Being a scribe spy had its perks. You were educated, connected, and usually well paid. You could travel, meet important people, and attend feasts. But the risks? Tremendous. If caught spying, you weren't treated like a soldier or a rogue. You were considered a traitor with access. The punishment was rarely subtle. Some were imprisoned, others were hanged, or quietly removed, without so much as a trial. One unlucky scribe in Burgundy was sewn into a sack with stones and tossed into the river. And his only crime? Sending a letter too soon. But for every story of capture, there were many who slipped by unnoticed. Men who recorded history on one side of the parchment and rewrote it in code on the other. Women who posed as scribal assistants but passed notes through book margins. Secret networks that used copyists to funnel information across Europe faster than an army could march. And through it all, the scribe's greatest weapon wasn't a sword or a poison ring. It was memory. Many scribe spies could recite entire letters word for word after a single reading. If stopped at a checkpoint, they carried nothing. But in their minds, an entire week's worth of royal secrets and merchant movements. Today, we think of spies as sleek agents in suits. But the original masters of espionage wore robes, carried scrolls, and ended most days with an inkwell crust on their fingertips. Next, we'll shift from secrets to sweetness and explore the medieval career of the honey keeper, where bees, monks, and mead all meet in a field of buzzing calm. Not all medieval jobs were messy, loud, or terrifying. Some were, dare we say it, rather peaceful, or at least they seemed that way on the surface. One such role? The honey keeper. Known today as a beekeeper, but in the Middle Ages, this gentle profession carried more weight than you'd expect. Because where there were bees, there was honey. And where there was honey, there was power. Let's begin in a monastery. It's the 12th century. A Benedictine monk pulls on a veil of linen and approaches a wooden box buzzing with activity. Inside, thousands of bees, working tirelessly, oblivious to politics, plague, or papal decrees. The monk opens the hive with care, murmuring a prayer, not out of superstition, but respect. These were God's workers, and their product was divine. In the medieval world, honey wasn't just food. It was currency, medicine, and holy substance. Sugar, as we know it, was a rare luxury, imported at high prices and available mostly to the very wealthy. But honey? You could produce it yourself if you had bees, space, and the patience of a saint. Honey keepers were found in monasteries, noble estates, and rural villages. The job involved maintaining skeps, those classic dome-shaped bee homes made of straw or wicker. These were placed in quiet corners of fields, sometimes lined up like tiny medieval neighborhoods. No bee suits, no gloves. Just a veil if you were lucky, and a lifetime of learning when not to panic. Harvesting honey wasn't easy. Skeps weren't designed to be opened gently. In many cases, collecting the honey meant destroying the hive and starting over. It was a delicate balance. Take too much, and the bees die. Take too little, and your abbot asks why the mead tastes like boiled cabbage. And yes, mead, the drink of choice for monks, nobles, and wandering bards alike. Honey was fermented into this golden liquor that was both celebration and sacrament. Some monasteries specialized in it. Recipes were guarded like holy relics. A good honey keeper meant a happy cellar and a much more cheerful winter. But beyond food and drink, honey played a role in medieval medicine. Physicians used it to dress wounds, mix with herbs, and treat infections. It was believed to purify the body and soothe the soul. Combined with vinegar, it became a medieval energy drink. Applied to the skin, it was used to heal everything from ulcers to boils, though we'd like to stress that it was not a miracle cure, just a sticky one. And then there was beeswax, another gift from the hive. Churches relied on beeswax candles for light. Unlike cheaper tallow candles which smelled like your uncle's cooking gone wrong, beeswax burned clean and sweet. It was preferred for altars, processions, and any event where divine ambiance was needed. A good honeykeeper was also a wax master, melting down combs into smooth sticks of light. But perhaps the most fascinating part? Bee lore. Medieval people believed bees were sacred creatures, ordered, pure, and somehow more moral than most humans. It was thought that bees wouldn't enter a sinful house, that they sang psalms, that they mourned their keeper's death. There was even a ritual called telling the bees. When a beekeeper died, someone would go to the hives and whisper the news. A failure to do so might cause the bees to abandon the hive or stop producing honey. Superstition? Sure. But also a quiet acknowledgement of connection, that even the smallest lives feel grief. Honeykeeping wasn't a glamorous job. It didn't make you famous. It didn't get you invited to jousts. But it offered something else. Peace, purpose, and a few sweet spoonfuls of joy in a world often short on sweetness. And perhaps that's the perfect place to rest. Among the hives, in the late afternoon sun, listening to the soft, steady hum of creatures who ask for nothing but flowers and give so much more in return. And so, dear listener, we close the dusty ledger of medieval professions, from the rat-catcher's alleyways to the scriptorium's hush, from the clang of the innkeeper's kitchen to the soft hum of the honeykeeper's field. We've wandered through a world both strange and familiar. It turns out, history wasn't just kings and conquests. It was also tired monks with ink-stained sleeves, grumpy innkeepers stirring stew for the 7th time that day, jesters whispering jokes that saved their lives, and solitary sin-eaters who carried more than just bread. These jobs, odd as they may seem now, were the threads that held the Middle Ages together. They were the background hum of daily life, the people behind the scenes, quietly keeping order, offering comfort, or simply doing what had to be done, even when no one else wanted to. If your own job ever feels thankless, just remember, at least you're not chasing rats for a living, or dodging royalty while making sarcastic jokes in a hat with bells. Thank you for drifting through this world with me. If you enjoyed this journey, please give this episode a gentle like, tap that subscribe button, and maybe even whisper it to your local bees. Until next time, sleep well and dream of bannocks, baubles, and very judgmental heralds. Good night.